The sound of hymn books slamming shut echoed through the small wooden church in Panamint, California, like gunshots in the stillness of a Sunday morning in 1878. And Rebecca Owens knew without looking up that the congregation's eyes had found her again. She sat in the last pew as she always did, her hands folded over the worn fabric of her best dress, the only one that still fit properly, though it strained at the seams despite her careful stitching. The June heat made the cramped church feel even smaller, and sweat trickled down her back as Reverend Marshall droned on about temperance and righteousness. Rebecca had lived in Panamint for 3 years now, ever since her father died and left her the small boarding house on the edge of town. At 23, she ran the establishment alone, cooking meals for miners and drifters who paid their weekly rates and mostly kept to themselves. The work was hard and the hours long, but it was honest living, and she took pride in the cleanliness of her rooms and the quality of her cooking. Her mother had taught her well before the fever took her when Rebecca was just 15. The sermon ended, and the congregation began to file out into the blinding California sunshine. Rebecca waited, as she always did, letting the others leave first. It was easier that way, less chance of uncomfortable encounters in the narrow aisle. But today, Margaret Fitzgerald, the banker's wife, had apparently decided waiting was not necessary. "I swear, Rebecca Owens, you take up half the pew all by yourself," Margaret said loudly enough that her voice carried through the church. Several people who had been leaving stopped to listen. "It is a wonder the wood does not crack beneath you." Rebecca felt her face burn, but she kept her eyes down. This was not the first time, and she doubted it would be the last. Margaret had taken a particular dislike to her ever since Rebecca had refused to sell the boarding house to her husband at a fraction of its worth. Perhaps if you spent less time at your own table and more time on your knees in prayer, the Lord might see fit to grant you some self-control, Margaret continued, warming to her subject. Her daughter, a thin slip of a girl named Caroline, giggled behind her hand. "That is enough, Margaret," said elderly Mrs. Patterson, but her voice was soft, and Margaret ignored her completely. "It is shameful, truly shameful. A woman of your size, unmarried, running a boarding house full of men. What kind of example does that set? Bad enough you lumber around town like a fattened sow, but to think you serve food to decent Christian men, probably eating half of it yourself before it reaches the table." Rebecca's hands clenched in her lap, her fingernails digging into her palms. She had heard worse, survived worse, but something about the sanctity of the church being used as a venue for such cruelty made her throat tight with unshed tears. She started to rise, wanting nothing more than to escape into the bright day outside, but Margaret stepped closer, blocking her way. "Gluttony is a sin, Rebecca. Perhaps you should spend less time cooking and more time fasting, though I suppose with your appetite you would not last a day. Madam, I think you had better step aside." The voice was deep and quiet, but it carried a weight that made everyone in the church turn. Rebecca looked up to see a man standing in the doorway, his tall frame backlit by the sun, so that for a moment he seemed almost like an apparition. He stepped forward, and she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes the color of whiskey in candlelight. He wore dusty trail clothes, a gun belt sitting low on his hips, and his hat was in his hands. He looked travel-worn and tired, but his jaw was set with determination. "Excuse me?" Margaret turned to face him, her voice sharp with indignation. "This is a private conversation, sir, and none of your concern." "I am making it my concern." He walked down the aisle, his boots loud on the wooden floor. "I have been standing outside for the past 5 minutes, and I have heard every word you said to this lady, and I think it is time someone told you the truth." "How dare you!" Margaret's face was red now, splotchy with anger. "Who do you think you are?" "My name is Thomas Jefferson, madam, and I am new to town, but I do not need to have lived here long to recognize a bully when I see one." He stopped beside Rebecca's pew, close enough that she could smell dust and leather and something else, something clean like sage. "This woman here, she is worth 10 of you all combined." The silence in the church was absolute. Rebecca stared up at him, unable to quite believe what she was hearing. No one had ever defended her like this, certainly not a stranger, and definitely not in front of half the town's most prominent citizens. "You know nothing about her," Margaret sputtered, "nothing about her character or her reputation." "I know she comes to church," Thomas said calmly. "I know she sits quietly and minds her own business. I know she does not spend her time tearing down others to make herself feel bigger. That tells me plenty about her character, more than I can say for some. This is outrageous! Reverend Marshall, are you going to allow this vagrant to speak to me this way? The Reverend, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should all calm down and remember where we are. Good advice, Thomas said. He turned to Rebecca and offered his hand. Miss, would you allow me to escort you outside? Rebecca hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip strong but gentle as he helped her to her feet. Together they walked down the aisle, and the small crowd parted before them like the Red Sea. Margaret's face was purple with rage, but she said nothing more as they passed. Outside, Rebecca pulled her hand from his and turned to face him, her heart pounding. You should not have done that. Probably not, he agreed, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. But I have never been good at keeping quiet when I see something that is not right. You have made an enemy of the most influential woman in town. Her husband owns the bank, and she has the ear of nearly every respectable family in Panamint. Then it sounds like respectable does not mean much around here. He settled his hat back on his head, tipping it slightly to shade his eyes from the sun. Thomas Jefferson, like I said. Most folks call me Thomas. Like the president, Rebecca said quietly. My father had aspirations. His smile widened. Did not quite work out that way, but the name stuck. Rebecca Owens. She smoothed her skirt, acutely aware of how she must look to him, flushed and rumpled, and exactly what Margaret had accused her of being. I run the boarding house on the east side of town. I appreciate what you did, but you really did not have to. I know I did not have to. I wanted to. He glanced back at the church where people were starting to emerge, shooting curious looks their way. Is there somewhere we can talk that is not quite so public? Rebecca considered for a moment. She should say no, should thank him politely, and send him on his way. But something in his eyes, a straightforward honesty she rarely encountered, made her nod. My boarding house is a 10-minute walk. I was going to make dinner for the residents. If you are hungry, you would be welcome to join us. I would like that very much. They walked through town side by side, and Rebecca was intensely conscious of the stares that followed them. Panamint was a mining town, built on silver and hope, and its population had swelled rapidly over the past few years. But it still maintained the social structure of a much smaller place, with the same families holding power and everyone else scrambling for whatever scraps they could get. Rebecca had never quite fit into either category. How long have you been in Panamint? She asked, partly to break the silence and partly because she was genuinely curious. I rode in last night, spent the night at the livery with my horse since I did not know what lodgings were available. He glanced at her. I am looking for work. I heard the mines are hiring. They always are. The work is hard and dangerous, but it pays well enough if you do not mind the risk. I have done harder work. He did not elaborate, and Rebecca did not press. In the West, a person's past was their own business unless they chose to share it. The boarding house came into view, a 2-story structure that had seen better days but was well maintained. The paint was fresh, the windows clean, and the small porch swept clear of the dust that was constantly blowing in from the desert. Rebecca had worked hard to make it a place she could be proud of, even if the rest of the town looked down on her for it. It is not much, she said, suddenly self-conscious as they climbed the steps. But it is clean, and the beds are comfortable. It looks perfect. Thomas's voice was sincere. How many rooms do you have? 6 for boarders, plus my own. Right now I have 4 occupied, 3 miners and a gentleman who works at the assay office. She unlocked the door and led him inside. The front room served as a common area, with a worn sofa and several chairs arranged around a cold fireplace. Beyond it, she could see through to the dining room and the kitchen beyond that. The rates are $5 a week, which includes 2 meals a day and laundry once a week, if you are interested. I am definitely interested. Thomas looked around with an approving eye. This is exactly what I need. When could I move in? Today, if you like. I have a room on the 2nd floor, faces east so it gets morning sun. That can be nice in winter, though it is a bit warm in summer. I will take it. Rebecca felt a flutter of something in her chest, nervousness or excitement, or perhaps both. Let me show you upstairs, then I will start on dinner. The room was small but serviceable, with a single bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a chair by the window. Thomas set his saddlebags down and looked out at the view of the town and the barren mountains beyond. "This will do just fine," he said. "Thank you, Miss Owens." "Rebecca, please. We do not stand much on formality here." She backed toward the door. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour. I usually ring a bell to let everyone know." "I will be there." Rebecca hurried downstairs to the kitchen, her mind racing. She had not expected to take on a new boarder today, certainly not one who had defended her so publicly and made such a spectacle at the church. She knew there would be talk, knew that Margaret would make sure everyone heard her version of events. But as she began pulling out ingredients for dinner, she found she did not care as much as she thought she would. She made her specialty, beef stew with vegetables and fresh bread. The work was familiar and soothing, and she lost herself in the rhythm of chopping and stirring. By the time she rang the dinner bell, the kitchen was filled with the rich smells of cooking, and she felt calmer than she had all day. Her regular boarders came down first. John Miller and Pete Anderson were miners, rough-spoken but decent men, who always paid on time and caused no trouble. Sam Hartford was the youngest at 19, still learning the trade and eager to prove himself. Robert Chen worked at the assay office, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself, but always thanked her for her meals. Thomas came down last, his face and hands freshly washed, his hair still damp. He took the empty seat at the end of the table, nodding politely to the other men. "Gentlemen, this is Thomas Jefferson. He is taking the empty room upstairs," Rebecca announced as she brought the pot of stew to the table. "Thomas, these are your fellow boarders." There was a round of introductions and handshakes. John, the older of the two miners, squinted at Thomas. "Jefferson, you say? Any relation to the president?" "Only in name," Thomas replied easily. "My father had high hopes." That got a laugh from the table, and the conversation moved on to other topics. Rebecca served the stew and bread, then took her own seat. She always ate with her boarders, had from the beginning. It seemed wrong to cook for them and then hide away in the kitchen, and besides, she enjoyed the company. "Miss Rebecca, this is delicious as always," Sam said around a mouthful of bread. "I swear you could make a fortune with cooking like this." "She already makes a fortune off us," Pete joked. $5 a week for room and board, and she has got us all convinced it is a bargain." "It is a bargain," Robert said quietly. "I paid twice that in Sacramento and got half the quality." Rebecca smiled, pleased by the compliments. She loved to cook, always had, and it gave her satisfaction to see people enjoy what she made. It was one of the few things in her life that felt entirely hers, untainted by the judgment of others. Thomas ate steadily, his appreciation clear, in the way he cleaned his plate and accepted a second helping when she offered. When the meal was done and the table cleared, the men lingered over coffee, talking about the mine and the latest silver strike and whether the boom would last. "It will last as long as the silver does," John said philosophically. "And when it is gone, Panamint will go with it. That is the way of mining towns." "Cheerful thought," Pete said, but he did not disagree. Eventually, the men drifted away to their rooms or out to the saloon until only Thomas and Rebecca remained. She was washing dishes in the kitchen when he appeared in the doorway. "Can I help with those?" Rebecca turned, surprised. "Oh no, that is not necessary. You are a boarder, not hired help." "I know, but my mother taught me that when someone cooks you a meal like that, the least you can do is help clean up." He picked up a dish towel. "I will dry." They worked in companionable silence for a while, Rebecca washing and Thomas drying and stacking the plates on the shelf. It was unexpectedly pleasant having someone share the chore, and Rebecca found herself relaxing in a way she had not in a long time. "You are a good cook," Thomas said after a while. "Sam was right. You could make a fortune." "I do all right," Rebecca said. "The boarding house keeps me fed and housed, and I have a little saved. That is more than a lot of people can say." "It is. You should be proud of what you have built here." Rebecca's hands stilled in the soapy water. "Most people do not see it that way. Most people see an unmarried woman living alone with a house full of men and draw their own conclusions. Then most people are fools." Thomas set down the towel and leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me it is none of my business if you want." "Go ahead." "That woman at the church today, Margaret, is that a regular occurrence?" Rebecca resumed washing, focusing on the plate in her hands. "Often enough. Margaret has never liked me, but she is not the only one. People talk, especially women who have nothing better to do with their time. They say I am too fat, too improper, Too much of this or not enough of that. I have learned to live with it. You should not have to. Maybe not, but this is the world we live in. She rinsed the last plate and pulled the plug, watching the water swirl down the drain. Besides, it could be worse. At least I have my own business, my own home. I am not dependent on anyone, and that is worth more than respectability. Thomas was quiet for a moment. You are right, but you deserve both, respect and independence. Rebecca dried her hands on her apron and finally looked at him directly. Why did you do it? At the church, I mean. You do not know me. For all you knew, everything she said could have been true. But it was not. How did you know? I did not for certain. But I knew that even if it was true, it did not give her the right to treat you that way. No one deserves to be humiliated like that, especially not in a church that is supposed to be about compassion and forgiveness. He met her eyes steadily. And if I am being completely honest, I took one look at you and thought you had the saddest, kindest face I had ever seen. And I could not stand by and let someone stomp all over that kindness. Rebecca's breath caught. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. She did not know how to respond, what to say to this stranger who had walked into her life and turned it upside down in the space of a few hours. Thank you, she finally whispered, for what you did, for what you said. You do not have to thank me, Rebecca. I meant every word. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. Thomas found work at one of the mines, just as he had hoped, and left early each morning with John, Pete, and Sam. He returned in the evenings covered in dust and sweat, but always with a smile for Rebecca and a compliment for her cooking. The other boarders welcomed him easily into their group, and soon it felt as though he had always been part of the household. But Rebecca was acutely aware that things had changed, that something had shifted in her carefully ordered life. She found herself thinking about Thomas at odd moments, wondering what he was doing deep in the earth, whether he was safe, whether he was thinking of her too. It was foolish, she told herself. He was just another boarder, no different from the others. Except he was different, and she knew it. He had started staying after dinner to help her with the dishes, despite her protests. They would talk about everything and nothing, his words as easy as breath. He told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about his parents who had died of cholera when he was 20, about drifting west looking for something he could not quite name. She told him about her own parents, about the lonely years after her father's death, about her dreams of maybe someday expanding the boarding house or opening a restaurant. You should do it, Thomas said one evening as they stood side by side at the sink. Open a restaurant, I mean. You have the talent for it. It takes money, Rebecca said practically. More than I have saved, and even if I had it, people like Margaret would never patronize an establishment run by someone like me. Then they would miss out on the best food in California. He bumped her shoulder gently with his. And there are plenty of people in this town who are not like Margaret. Working men who would appreciate good food at a fair price. Families who do not care about social standing, just about feeding their children well. Maybe, Rebecca allowed, but she could feel herself smiling at the thought, at the possibility of it. The trouble started about 2 weeks after Thomas arrived. Rebecca was at the general store, purchasing flour and sugar and other staples, when she overheard 2 women talking in the next aisle. I heard she has taken in a new man, one of them said in a stage whisper clearly meant to be overheard. Young and handsome, too. Lord knows what goes on in that house. Margaret Fitzgerald says it is a disgrace. An unmarried woman living with 5 men under one roof. Something should be done about it. What can be done? She owns the property outright, as long as she is not breaking any laws. There are laws, and then there are laws. Moral laws, I mean. A woman like that, flaunting herself and her sins for all to see. Rebecca's hands tightened on her basket. She wanted to walk around the corner and confront them, demand to know what sins they thought she was committing. But she knew it would do no good. People believed what they wanted to believe, saw what they wanted to see. She paid for her purchases quickly and left, but the words stayed with her, poison seeping into her thoughts. By the time she got home, she had worked herself into a state of anxiety. What if the talk got worse? What if it affected her business? She could not afford to lose boarders, could not afford to have her reputation, such as it was, damaged any further. Thomas found her that evening, sitting on the back porch, staring out at the darkening desert. He sat down beside her without asking, his presence solid and reassuring. What is wrong? Rebecca told him about the women at the store, their voices tight with false concern and real malice. Thomas listened without interrupting, his jaw getting tighter as she spoke. "Let them talk," he said when she finished. "Their words cannot hurt you unless you let them. But they can hurt my business. If people start believing I am running some kind of immoral house, no decent man will board here. Any man who believes that is not decent and not worth having." Thomas reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. The touch sent a shock through her, warm and electric. "Rebecca, you cannot live your life worried about what small-minded people think. You will drive yourself crazy trying. Easy for you to say. You are a man. No one questions your morals or your choices. You are right, it is easier for me, but that does not make it right." He squeezed her hand. "And for what it is worth, I think you are the most moral person I have met in a long time. You work hard, you treat people fairly, you do not cheat or lie or hurt others for your own gain. That is more than most people can say, including those women at the store." Rebecca blinked back tears. "Why do you care so much? Why are you always defending me?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and serious. "Because I have come to care about you, Rebecca. More than I probably should, given that I have only known you a few weeks. But I cannot help it. You are smart and kind and brave, and you deserve better than what this town gives you." Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Thomas, you do not have to say anything. I just wanted you to know." He stood up, still holding her hand, and gently pulled her to her feet. "Come on, let us go inside. It is getting cold." But as they walked back into the house, Rebecca found that she was not cold at all. She was warm all over, warm with the knowledge that someone saw her, really saw her, and found her worthy. It was a feeling she had never experienced before, and she wanted to hold on to it forever. The next Sunday, Rebecca almost decided not to go to church. The thought of facing Margaret and the others, of sitting through another service where she felt like a specimen on display, was exhausting. But she had never been one to hide from difficulty, and she was not about to start now. Thomas asked if he could accompany her, and she agreed. They walked to church together in the early morning light, and Rebecca tried not to notice the way people stared or the whispers that followed them. Thomas seemed oblivious, or perhaps he simply did not care. He held the church door open for her and followed her to her usual pew in the back. Margaret was there, of course, sitting in her place of prominence near the front. She turned to look when Rebecca and Thomas entered, her eyes narrowing. Throughout the service, Rebecca could feel the weight of the woman's disapproval, heavy as a stone on her shoulders. When the service ended, Rebecca hoped to slip out quickly. But Margaret was waiting in the aisle, flanked by two other women Rebecca recognized as her particular friends. "Mr. Jefferson," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How nice to see you have found employment in our town. At the mine, I understand." "Yes, madam," Thomas replied neutrally. "And you are boarding at Miss Owens' establishment?" "I am." Margaret's smile turned sharp. "How interesting. You know, there has been quite a bit of talk about that boarding house lately, about the propriety of it, or lack thereof." "Has there?" Thomas's voice was cool. "What a shame that people do not have better things to occupy their time." "It is not a matter of idle gossip, Mr. Jefferson. It is a matter of community standards. An unmarried woman living alone with multiple men, it is simply not done in respectable society." "Then I suppose it is lucky that Miss Owens is not particularly concerned with your definition of respectable." Thomas took Rebecca's arm. "Now, if you will excuse us, we have matters to attend to." But Margaret was not finished. "You should know, Mr. Jefferson, that associating with someone of Miss Owens's reputation could reflect poorly on you. There are other boarding houses in town, ones run by married couples or widows of impeccable character. I am quite happy where I am, thank you. Even knowing that she is likely taking advantage of you, overcharging for substandard rooms and meals while she grows fat off the profits?" Rebecca felt Thomas go rigid beside her. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Madam, I am going to say this once, and I suggest you listen carefully. Miss Owens runs the finest boarding house I have ever stayed in. Her rooms are clean, her meals are excellent, and her prices are more than fair. As for her size, that is none of your business, none of my business, and none of anyone else's business but hers. The fact that you continue to bring it up says far more about your character than it does about hers. How dare you speak to me that way? How dare you speak to her the way you do? Thomas countered. What has she ever done to you except refuse to be cowed by your bullying? You want to talk about Christian values, about morality and decency? Try looking in a mirror, Mrs. Fitzgerald, because what I see when I look at you is not a godly woman. It is a bitter, cruel person who tears others down to make herself feel superior. The church had gone completely silent. Even Reverend Marshall, who had been shaking hands at the door, had stopped to stare. Margaret's face was white, then red, then white again. My husband will hear about this, she hissed. You will regret speaking to me this way. I doubt it. Thomas turned to Rebecca. Are you ready to go? Rebecca nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They walked out together, and this time no one tried to stop them. It was not until they were halfway home that Rebecca found her voice. You should not have said those things. Her husband owns the bank. He could make things difficult for you. Let him try. Thomas, I am serious. You could lose your job, or worse. He stopped walking and turned to face her. Rebecca, listen to me. I have worked in mines from Colorado to Arizona. I have been a ranch hand and a railroad worker and a dozen other things. If I lose this job, I will find another. But what I cannot do is stand by and watch someone treat you like that. I meant what I said that first day at the church. You are worth 10 of them combined. You are worth 100 of them. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Why? Why do you care so much? Because I am in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, stark and honest and terrifying. Rebecca stared at him, sure she must have heard wrong. But the look in his eyes told her she had not. You cannot be, she whispered. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you get up before dawn to make breakfast for your boarders. I know you stitch the tears in their shirts even though they never ask. I know you leave scraps out for the stray cat that lives in your barn. I know you have the kindest heart of anyone I have ever met, and you hide it behind walls because people have hurt you too many times. He took her hands in his. I know that when you smile, really smile, it is like watching the sun come up. And I know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. Thomas, I am not. I am not the kind of woman men fall in love with. I am not pretty or delicate or any of the things I'm supposed to be. You are beautiful. I am fat. You are beautiful, he repeated firmly. You are strong and capable and real. You do not simper or flirt or play games. You are exactly who you are. No apologies. No pretense. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious? Rebecca was crying now, tears streaming down her face. No one had ever said these things to her. No one had ever looked at her the way Thomas was looking at her now, like she was something valuable and cherished. I do not know what to say, she managed. You do not have to say anything. I am not asking for anything from you, Rebecca. I just needed you to know. I needed you to know that you are loved, truly and completely, exactly as you are. She looked up at him, this man who had walked into her life like a force of nature and turned everything upside down, and she realized, with a clarity that took her breath away, that she loved him too. She had been falling in love with him since that first day in the church, maybe even before, in that moment when he stepped into the doorway like a hero from one of the dime novels she secretly read. I love you too, she said, her voice shaking. I did not think I could, did not think anyone would ever want me enough for it to matter. But I do. I love you, Thomas Jefferson. His smile was like dawn breaking over the mountains. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and she let herself lean into his strength. They stood there in the middle of the dusty street, holding each other, and for the first time in her life, Rebecca felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The days that followed were the happiest Rebecca had ever known. Thomas courted her properly, despite the fact that they lived under the same roof. He brought her wildflowers from the desert and small treasures he found in the mine, bits of quartz and fool's gold that glittered like real treasure. They took walks in the evening, after dinner and dishes, talking about their dreams and fears and everything in between. The other boarders were delighted by the development. John and Pete teased Thomas mercilessly but in a good-natured way, and Sam declared it the most romantic thing he had ever seen. Robert, in his quiet way, told Rebecca that he was happy for her, that she deserved every bit of joy that came her way. But not everyone was pleased. Margaret Fitzgerald's campaign against Rebecca intensified, her whispers and innuendos growing more vicious. She spread rumors that Rebecca had seduced Thomas, that she was using feminine wiles to trap him into marriage. Some people believed her, but many did not. The working men of Panamint, the miners and laborers who knew Thomas and respected him, saw through Margaret's lies, and slowly, quietly, public opinion began to shift. It started with small things. A miner's wife who had always ignored Rebecca in the street stopped to say hello. The owner of the general store, who had always been coolly polite, began to chat with her about the weather and the price of flour. The Reverend, perhaps feeling guilty about his silence during Margaret's attacks, made a point of shaking both her and Thomas's hands after services. "People are talking," Rebecca told Thomas one evening as they sat together on the porch. "But this time, it is not all bad. Some of them, I think they are starting to see Margaret for what she is." "About time," Thomas said. He had his arm around her shoulders, and she was nestled against his side, warm and content. "You know what I think we should do?" "What?" "Get married, soon. I do not want to wait." Rebecca's heart leaped. They had talked about marriage, had acknowledged that it was where their relationship was heading, but he had never been so direct about it before. "Are you sure?" she asked. "You do not have to marry me just to protect my reputation." "I am not marrying you for your reputation. I am marrying you because I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone else." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Marry me, Rebecca. Be my wife. Let me spend every day for the rest of my life showing you how loved you are." "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, of course, yes." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. And Rebecca knew, with every fiber of her being, that this was right, that this was what she had been waiting for all her life, even when she had not believed it was possible. They were married 3 weeks later in the same church where they had first spoken, where Thomas had first defended her against Margaret's cruelty. The ceremony was simple, attended by the other boarders and a scattering of townspeople who had come to wish them well. Margaret was notably absent, as were her closest friends, but Rebecca found she did not care. She had Thomas, and that was all that mattered. Reverend Marshall performed the ceremony, his voice warm with genuine feeling as he spoke about love and commitment. When Thomas slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. And when he kissed her, sealing their vows, the small congregation erupted in applause. They held a reception at the boarding house, and Rebecca marveled at how many people came. Miners and their families, shopkeepers, even the mayor stopped by to offer his congratulations. Rebecca had prepared a feast, knowing she might not have another opportunity to cook for several days, and she was pleased to see everyone enjoying themselves. "You look happy," John said, coming up to her with a cup of punch. "Happier than I have ever seen you." "I am happy," Rebecca said simply. "Happier than I ever thought I could be. Thomas is a good man. He will treat you right." "I know he will." As the evening wore on and the guests began to leave, Rebecca found herself standing with Thomas in the kitchen, looking out at the remains of the party. Dishes were stacked on every surface, and there was cake crumbled on the floor, but she did not care. It had been perfect, every moment of it. "Ready to go upstairs, Mrs. Jefferson?" Thomas asked, his voice low and intimate. Mrs. Jefferson. The name sent a thrill through her. "Yes," she said. "I am ready." Their first months of marriage were an adjustment. Thomas moved his things into Rebecca's room, and they learned to share the space, to navigate around each other in the comfortable intimacy of husband and wife. The other boarders were respectful of their privacy, and life in the boarding house continued much as it had before, except now Rebecca had a partner, someone to share the work and the worries. Thomas proved to be as helpful a husband as he had been a boarder. He took over some of the heavier chores, repairing the porch steps and fixing the leaky roof that had plagued Rebecca for months. He also surprised her with his skill at baking, a talent he had learned from his mother, and soon they were working side by side in the kitchen, creating meals that had the other boarders groaning with pleasure. "You two are going to make us all fat," Pete complained one evening over a dessert of apple pie and cream, but he was smiling as he said it, and he asked for a second slice. Rebecca found that marriage agreed with her. She had been independent for so long, had grown so used to relying only on herself, that she had not realized how lonely she had been. Having Thomas beside her, sharing her days and her nights, brought a joy she had not anticipated. They talked about everything, from the mundane details of running the boarding house to their hopes for the future. "I have been thinking," Thomas said one evening as they sat together in their room, About what you said, about wanting to open a restaurant someday. It was just a dream, Rebecca said, not something that is likely to happen. Why not? We have both been saving money. I have been putting aside nearly half my wages each week, and with what you are earning from the boarding house, we could probably have enough in a year or two to at least look into it. Rebecca stared at him. You would do that? Use your savings to help me open a restaurant? Our savings, Thomas corrected. We are married now, remember? What is mine is yours, and what is yours is mine. And yes, I would do that. I would do anything to see you happy, to see you fulfill your dreams. I do not deserve you, Rebecca whispered. Yes, you do. You deserve this and so much more. But before they could make any concrete plans, life intervened in the form of unexpected news. Rebecca had been feeling off for several weeks, tired and nauseated in the mornings. At first, she attributed it to working too hard, or perhaps a mild stomach ailment. But when she missed her monthly courses 2 months in a row, she began to suspect the truth. She visited the town doctor, a gruff but competent man named Dr. Harrison, who confirmed her suspicions. She was pregnant, about 3 months along if he had to guess. The baby would come sometime in the spring. Rebecca walked home in a daze, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach. A baby. She was going to have a baby. The idea was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. She had no idea if she would be a good mother, had no experience with children beyond watching them play in the street. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that she wanted this child, wanted to hold Thomas's baby in her arms, and raise it with all the love she had inside her. Thomas was in the barn when she got home, tending to his horse. She found him there, curry comb in hand, and he looked up with a smile when she entered. Hey, how was your errand in town? Thomas, I have something to tell you. She paused, suddenly nervous. They had never discussed children, had never talked about whether he wanted to be a father. What if he was not ready? What if he did not want this? What is it? His smile faded, replaced by concern. Rebecca, what is wrong? Are you all right? I am fine. Better than fine, actually. She took a deep breath. Thomas, I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then a grin spread across his face, so wide and bright that it made her heart ache with love for him. A baby? Really? Really, Dr. Harrison confirmed it today. The baby should come in late April or early May. Thomas dropped the curry comb and crossed the space between them in 2 strides. He picked her up and spun her around laughing, and Rebecca found herself laughing too, dizzy with relief and joy. We are going to have a baby, he said, setting her down carefully as if she might break. I am going to be a father, and you are going to be a mother. Rebecca, this is the best news I have ever heard. You are not upset, not worried. Upset? Why would I be upset? This is everything I did not even know I wanted. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. I love you so much, and I am going to love our child just as much. We are going to be a family, Rebecca. A real family. The pregnancy was not easy. Rebecca's morning sickness lasted well into her 4th month, and she found herself exhausted by tasks that had never bothered her before. But Thomas was endlessly patient, taking over more of the household duties and insisting she rest whenever she felt tired. The other boarders were supportive too, especially Sam, who seemed fascinated by the whole process and asked constant questions about how she was feeling and whether the baby was kicking yet. As Rebecca's belly grew, so did the stares and whispers. But this time, they were different. People seemed more curious than malicious, and more than one woman stopped her in the street to offer advice or congratulations. Even Margaret Fitzgerald seemed to have quieted her campaign of harassment, though Rebecca suspected that had more to do with the fact that several prominent families had made it clear they did not appreciate her behavior. She knows she has lost, Thomas said when Rebecca mentioned it. Public opinion has turned against her. People see that we are just a normal couple, building a life together. They see that you are a good woman who does not deserve the treatment she gave you. I am not sure I will ever be fully accepted here, Rebecca said, but I think you are right. Things are better than they were. And they will keep getting better. You will see. Winter came to Panamint, bringing cold winds and occasional dustings of snow on the mountains. Rebecca grew larger, her belly swelling with the baby inside her. By January, she could no longer hide her condition, and she found herself the subject of many knowing smiles and bits of advice from the women in town. Make sure you eat plenty of red meat, one old woman told her at the general store. Keeps your strength up for the birthing. Walk every day, even when you do not feel like it, another advised. Makes the baby come easier. Rebecca listened politely and took what advice seemed sensible, ignoring the rest. She had purchased a book on childbirth and infant care from a traveling salesman, and she studied it diligently, trying to prepare herself for what was to come. Thomas was a constant source of support. He talked to her belly every night, telling the baby about his day and making plans for their future. He built a cradle from scrap wood, sanding it smooth and painting it a soft cream color. He also surprised her by knitting a tiny blanket, a skill his mother had taught him and he had not forgotten. "You knit?" Rebecca asked, watching his nimble fingers work the yarn. "My mother said every person should know how to make something with their hands," Thomas replied. "I am not as good as she was, but I can manage a simple blanket." "It is perfect," Rebecca said, touching the soft wool. "Our baby is lucky to have you as a father. Our baby is lucky to have you as a mother." In February, Rebecca received an unexpected visitor. She was in the kitchen preparing bread dough when there was a knock at the front door. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it, surprised to find Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had tried to stop Margaret's tirade at the church all those months ago. "Mrs. Patterson, what a surprise. Please come in." The old woman entered, leaning heavily on her cane. "Thank you, dear. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. Would you like some tea?" "That would be lovely." They settled in the front room, and Rebecca served tea and some of the cookies she had baked that morning. Mrs. Patterson ate one appreciatively before speaking. "I came to apologize," she said without preamble, "for what happened at the church last year. I should have spoken up more forcefully, should have put a stop to Margaret's behavior. I have been feeling guilty about it ever since." Rebecca was touched. "You did speak up. You told her it was enough. But I did not stop her. I let her continue to berate you, to say those terrible things. And I am ashamed of that." The old woman set down her teacup. "You are a good woman, Rebecca, and you did not deserve any of what she said or did. I want you to know that many of us in this town admire you. You have made a success of yourself through hard work and determination, and you have done it with grace and kindness. That is something to be proud of." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. That means more to me than you know. I also wanted to bring you this." Mrs. Patterson reached into her bag and pulled out a small quilt, beautifully stitched in shades of yellow and white. "For the baby. I made it myself." "Oh, Mrs. Patterson, it is beautiful, but you did not have to do that." "I wanted to. Every baby deserves to be welcomed into the world with love and something handmade just for them." She smiled. "You are going to be a wonderful mother, Rebecca. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." After Mrs. Patterson left, Rebecca sat for a long time with the quilt in her lap, marveling at the kindness of people. It was easy to focus on the Margaret Fitzgeralds of the world, the ones who were cruel and small-minded, but there were also people like Mrs. Patterson, who saw goodness and chose to nurture it. That was worth remembering. March brought warmer weather and the first signs of spring. Rebecca was huge now, her belly so large she could barely see her feet. Simple tasks exhausted her, and she found herself napping in the afternoons, something she had never done before. Thomas had taken over most of the cooking, working with her instructions to prepare meals for the boarders. He was getting quite good at it, and the men did not seem to mind the change. "Only a few more weeks now," Dr. Harrison said during one of Rebecca's visits. "Maybe a month at most. The baby is positioned well, and everything looks healthy. You just need to rest and stay strong." "Easier said than done when there is a boarding house to run," Rebecca replied. "Then let your husband run it for a while. That is what he is there for." Rebecca tried to follow the doctor's advice, but it was hard to relinquish control. The boarding house was her creation, her pride, and she was not used to letting others manage it. But Thomas was insistent, and eventually she gave in, spending her days reading and sewing and preparing for the baby's arrival. The baby came on a warm April evening, 3 weeks earlier than Dr. Harrison had predicted. Rebecca had been feeling odd all day, a low ache in her back that would not go away. By the time Thomas got home from the mine, the ache had intensified into cramping pains that took her breath away. "It is time," she told him, gripping the kitchen table as another contraction hit. Thomas, the baby is coming. He went pale but sprang into action, sending Sam to fetch Dr. Harrison and helping Rebecca upstairs to their room. The next hours were a blur of pain and effort, Dr. Harrison's calm voice guiding her through the contractions, Thomas holding her hand and wiping her face with a cool cloth. "You are doing great, Rebecca," Thomas kept saying. "Just a little longer. You are so strong." And then, in the early hours of the morning, the baby arrived. A lusty cry filled the room, and Dr. Harrison lifted a squirming, red-faced infant. "It is a boy," the doctor announced with a smile. "A healthy baby boy. A boy." Rebecca watched through exhausted, tear-filled eyes as the doctor cleaned the baby and wrapped him in the blanket Thomas had knitted. Then he was placing the infant in her arms, and she was looking down at her son's tiny face, marveling at the perfection of him. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, little one." Thomas was beside her, his arm around her shoulders, staring at their son with an expression of wonder. "He is beautiful," he said hoarsely. "Rebecca, he is perfect." "He is," she agreed. "He really is." They named him Daniel Thomas Jefferson, and he became the center of their world. Rebecca had never known she could love something so completely, so overwhelmingly. Every moment with him was precious, from the late-night feedings to the first time he smiled at her, a toothless grin that made her heart swell with joy. Thomas was a devoted father. He took over even more of the boarding house duties so Rebecca could focus on caring for Daniel, and he spent every spare moment with his son. He would hold the baby for hours, walking the floor when Daniel was fussy, singing him lullabies in a deep, off-key voice that somehow always did the trick. The other boarders were enchanted with the baby. John whittled him a set of toy blocks, and Pete brought him a rattle he had purchased in town. Sam was particularly smitten, always volunteering to hold Daniel and making silly faces to get him to laugh. Even Robert, usually so reserved, could be found peeking into the cradle when he thought no one was looking. "This house has become downright domestic," John joked one evening at dinner, but there was no malice in his words, only affection. As Daniel grew, so did Rebecca's confidence as a mother. She learned to read his cries, to know when he was hungry or tired or just in need of comfort. She marveled at every milestone, every new skill he learned, and through it all, Thomas was beside her, sharing in the wonder and the work. By the time Daniel was 6 months old, Rebecca felt like she had finally found her place in the world. She had a husband who loved her, a son who was healthy and thriving, and a home that was filled with warmth and laughter. The boarding house was doing well, better than it ever had, and she and Thomas had even started saving again, putting aside money for the restaurant they still dreamed of opening. One Sunday after church, they were walking home with Daniel in Rebecca's arms when they encountered Margaret Fitzgerald. The woman was older now, her face more lined, and there was a brittleness to her that had not been there before. She looked at Rebecca, then at Thomas, then at the baby, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes that might have been regret. "Mrs. Jefferson," she said stiffly, "your son is very handsome." It was the first civil word Margaret had spoken to her in over a year. Rebecca considered ignoring her, simply walking past without acknowledgement. But then she looked at Thomas, who gave her a small, encouraging nod, and she found herself responding. "Thank you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. We think so." They stood there for an awkward moment, and then Margaret said, "I hope he brings you much joy." "He does," Rebecca replied. "More than I can say." Margaret nodded once and walked away, and Rebecca watched her go with mixed feelings. She did not forgive the woman for the pain she had caused, but she also did not feel the need to carry anger anymore. Margaret had lost in the end. She had tried to tear Rebecca down and had failed. That was victory enough. "You were very gracious," Thomas said as they resumed walking. "I suppose I can afford to be gracious now," Rebecca replied. "I have everything I ever wanted. What does it hurt to be kind?" "That is my wife, always seeing the best in people, even when they do not deserve it." They continued home, and as they walked through the door of the boarding house, Rebecca felt a profound sense of gratitude. This life, this family, this love, it was more than she had ever dared to hope for, and she was going to treasure every moment of it. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Daniel grew into a bright, curious boy, who had his father's eyes and his mother's smile. When he was 3, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant again, and 9 months later, she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth. 2 years after that came another boy, James William, and the boarding house rang with the sounds of children's laughter. They finally opened their restaurant when Daniel was 5. It was a modest establishment, just a small dining room attached to the boarding house, but it was theirs. Rebecca cooked while Thomas managed the front, seating customers and taking orders. They served simple, hearty food at prices working families could afford, and word quickly spread that the Jefferson restaurant was the best place to eat in Panamint. The restaurant was a success beyond their wildest dreams. Rebecca's reputation as a cook brought in customers from all over town, and soon they were so busy they had to hire help. They brought on a local girl to assist in the kitchen and a young man to help Thomas with serving. The boarding house continued to operate, though now with fewer rooms as they needed the space for their growing family. Margaret Fitzgerald never became a friend, but over the years her hostility faded into grudging respect. Her husband's bank eventually failed during a financial panic, and the family moved away from Panamint. Rebecca felt a twinge of sympathy for them, remembering what it was like to be the subject of town gossip, but mostly she was relieved to see them go. Life was not always easy. The mine began to play out, and Panamint's population dwindled as people moved on to new strikes and new opportunities. The boarding house had fewer guests and the restaurant had fewer customers, but Rebecca and Thomas adapted, lowering their prices and offering new services. They started a small bakery, selling bread and pies to families in town. Rebecca taught cooking classes to women who wanted to learn her skills. They found ways to survive, to thrive even, because they were together, and that made all the difference. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Rebecca with a trip. He had arranged for Mrs. Patterson to watch the children for a week, and he took Rebecca to San Francisco, a city she had always dreamed of seeing but never thought she would visit. They stayed in a nice hotel, ate at fancy restaurants, and walked along the waterfront watching the ships come in. It was magical, a reminder that they were not just parents and business owners, but husband and wife, lovers who had built a life together against all odds. "Do you ever regret it?" Rebecca asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset over the bay. "Marrying me, I mean? Tying yourself to someone who made your life more complicated?" Thomas looked at her as if she had grown a second head. "Regret it? Rebecca, marrying you was the best decision I ever made. You are my whole world, you and our children. I would not change a single thing about our life together. Even the parts where Margaret made things difficult, even when the town was gossiping about us. Especially those parts, because those were the moments when I got to stand up for you, when I got to show you how much I loved you." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Rebecca, you have made me happier than I ever thought possible. Every day with you is a gift. Do not ever doubt that." She leaned her head on his shoulder, content in a way she had never been before. "I love you, Thomas Jefferson. I love you too, Rebecca Jefferson. Always and forever." When they returned to Panamint, it was to find their children well and happy, and the business running smoothly in their absence. Life settled back into its comfortable rhythm, the days filled with cooking and cleaning and the joyful chaos of raising 3 children. Daniel showed an early aptitude for numbers and announced at age 12 that he wanted to be an accountant. Sarah was creative and artistic, always drawing pictures or making up elaborate stories. James was still young, only 7, but he seemed to have inherited his parents' love of cooking and could often be found in the kitchen, helping Rebecca with whatever she would allow. As the children grew older, Rebecca found herself with more time to pursue her own interests. She started writing down her recipes, thinking perhaps she might compile them into a book someday. She joined a women's church group, finding friendship with women who saw past her size to the person she was inside. She volunteered at the school, helping with reading lessons and organizing fundraisers. Thomas continued to work, though no longer in the mines. He had saved enough to buy a small plot of land on the edge of town, and he spent his days farming and raising a few head of cattle. It was hard work, but he loved it, loved being outdoors and working with his hands. And every evening, he came home to Rebecca and their children, to hot meals and warm embraces, and all the love a man could ask for. When Daniel turned 18, he left for San Francisco to pursue his education, determined to make something of himself. It was hard to see him go, but Rebecca was proud of the young man he had become. Responsible and kind, intelligent and ambitious, he was everything she had hoped he would be. Sarah married at 20, a nice young man who worked as a clerk in the general store. They had a small wedding in the church where Rebecca and Thomas had married, and Rebecca cried happy tears as she watched her daughter exchange vows. James, at 17, was still at home, but he talked about opening his own restaurant someday, maybe in one of the bigger cities where there were more opportunities. Rebecca was 50 years old when she realized that her life had turned out nothing like she had expected and everything like she had secretly hoped. She was respected in town, not despite her size, but because of her character. She had a successful business, a wonderful family, and a love that had only deepened with time. The girl who had been shamed in church all those years ago seemed like someone from another lifetime, someone she barely recognized. One Sunday, she and Thomas were sitting in their usual pew, now toward the middle of the church rather than the back. The new reverend, a young man who had come to Panamint after Reverend Marshall retired, was preaching about the Good Samaritan and the importance of kindness to strangers. Rebecca felt Thomas's hand find hers, warm and familiar, and she squeezed it gently. After the service, they walked home slowly, enjoying the late spring sunshine. The boarding house had been sold years ago, once the restaurant became successful enough to support them. They now lived in a comfortable house near the center of town, with a garden that Rebecca tended and a porch where they spent summer evenings. "Do you remember the first time we walked home from church together?" Thomas asked. "Of course I do. You had just defended me against Margaret and told me I was worth 10 of everyone there. I meant it, you know, every word." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Rebecca, you have given me a life I never dreamed I would have. You have made me a better man, a happier man. And I want you to know that every day I thank God for bringing me to Panamint, for leading me to that church on that particular Sunday, for giving me the courage to speak up." Rebecca blinked back tears. "I thank God for that too. You saved me, Thomas, not just from Margaret's cruelty, but from a life of loneliness and self-doubt. You showed me that I was worthy of love, of respect, of all the good things I had been afraid to want." "We saved each other," Thomas said softly. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears that had started to fall. "And we built something beautiful together, a family, a life, a love that will last forever." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Rebecca felt the same flutter in her heart that she had felt all those years ago when he first told her he loved her. Some things never changed, and some things got better with time. Their love was both. They continued home hand in hand, and as they walked through the door of their house, Rebecca felt a profound sense of peace. She had lived a good life, a full life, a life rich with love and purpose. She had weathered storms and celebrated triumphs. She had raised children and built a business. She had loved and been loved in return. That night, after dinner and dishes, after James had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Rebecca and Thomas sat together on the porch watching the stars come out. The desert air was cool and clean, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had not gone to church that day?" Thomas asked. "If I had arrived an hour later, or decided to skip the service altogether?" "Sometimes," Rebecca admitted, "but I think we would have found each other somehow. I think we were meant to be together." "I think so too." He pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "Rebecca, promise me something." "Anything?" "Promise me you will never forget how extraordinary you are, how strong and brave and beautiful. Promise me you will never let anyone make you feel less than you are." "I promise," she whispered, "as long as you promise the same. You are my hero, Thomas. You always will be." They sat there for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead, comfortable in the silence and in each other's presence. Rebecca thought about the young woman she had been, scared and ashamed, sitting in the back pew of the church hoping to be invisible. She thought about the moment Thomas had stood up for her, had declared her worth to a room full of people who had only ever seen her as less than. She thought about the journey they had taken together, from strangers to friends to lovers to partners in every sense of the word. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would not change a single thing. Every hardship, every struggle, every moment of pain had led her to this place, to this man, to this life, and it was more than she had ever dared to dream. In the years that followed, Rebecca and Thomas watched their children build lives of their own. Daniel became a successful accountant in San Francisco, married a lovely woman, and gave them 3 grandchildren. Sarah and her husband took over the restaurant when Rebecca and Thomas finally decided to retire, running it with the same care and dedication. James opened his own establishment in Sacramento, earning a reputation as one of the finest chefs in California. Rebecca and Thomas grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, deeper, more precious with each passing year. They took care of each other through illnesses and injuries, through the sorrows of losing friends and the joys of welcoming new grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. On their 50th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a party at the church. The room was filled with people, friends and family and neighbors who had come to celebrate 5 decades of marriage. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and tears, and through it all, Rebecca and Thomas sat side by side, holding hands, their eyes bright with love and memory. "You know what the secret is?" Thomas said when someone asked him how they had stayed married so long. "The secret is finding someone who sees you for who you really are, all the good and bad and everything in between, and loves you anyway. Rebecca is that person for me. She always has been." Rebecca squeezed his hand, too emotional to speak, but she did not need words. Everything she felt was there in her eyes, in the smiles she gave him, in the way she leaned into him, as if he were her anchor in a stormy sea. When the party ended and they were finally alone, walking slowly back to their house in the twilight, Thomas stopped and turned to her. "Thank you," he said simply, "for 50 years of happiness, for being my wife, my partner, my best friend, for giving me a life beyond my wildest dreams." "Thank you for defending me that day in church," Rebecca replied, "for seeing something worthwhile in me when I could not see it in myself, for loving me so completely that I learned to love myself. It was the easiest thing I ever did." They stood there in the fading light, 2 old people who had loved each other through everything life could throw at them. And as they turned toward home, toward the house they had shared for decades, toward all the memories and moments that made up a life well lived, Rebecca knew that this was the truest happy ending she could have asked for. Not a fairy tale ending where everything was perfect, but a real ending where 2 people had chosen each other every day for 50 years, where love had not erased the hardships, but had made them bearable, where the simple act of standing up for someone had led to a lifetime of standing together. The town of Panamint eventually became a ghost town, as so many mining towns did. The silver ran out, the people moved on, and the buildings fell into disrepair, but the little church remained standing, a monument to the community that had once thrived there. And if you went there on a quiet day, when the wind was still and the desert sun was warm, you might almost hear the echo of hymns sung long ago. You might almost see a young woman sitting in the back pew and a young man standing up to defend her. You might almost feel the beginning of a love story that would span a lifetime. Rebecca and Thomas lived to see their 75th wedding anniversary, a milestone that brought family from across California and beyond. They were both in their 90s by then, frail but still sharp-minded, still deeply in love. The celebration was smaller than the 50th, held in their home with just close family, but it was no less meaningful. 75 years, Daniel marveled, looking at his parents with awe. "That is incredible." "It does not feel that long," Thomas said. His voice was weaker now, his hands shook, but his eyes were clear when he looked at Rebecca. "Feels like just yesterday I walked into that church and saw your mother for the first time." "Best day of my life," Rebecca said. She was tiny now, her body finally failing after 9 decades of hard work and hard living, but her spirit was as strong as ever. "Well, second best. The best was when you told me you loved me. I tell you that every day." "I know, and I never get tired of hearing it." 2 months later, Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep, Rebecca's hand clasped in his. She sat with him for a long time after, memorizing the lines of his face, whispering all the things she wanted him to know, that he had been the love of her life, that he had made her happier than she had ever thought possible, that she would carry him in her heart until they met again. Rebecca lived for another 6 months without him, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She spent her days looking through old photographs and telling stories about Thomas, about their life together, about the day in church when everything changed. And when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, She did so with a smile on her face, knowing that she had lived a full and beautiful life, and that the greatest adventure was still ahead, waiting for her to rejoin the man who had loved her exactly as she was. They were buried side by side in the cemetery on the hill above Panamint, under a shared headstone that read, Thomas and Rebecca Jefferson, beloved husband and wife, parents and grandparents, together forever, as they were always meant to be. And carved beneath those words, at the request of their children, was a simple phrase that summed up their entire relationship. She was worth 10 of them all combined, and he was the one who saw it first.